Hey there, you're listening to the EmpowerTech Podcast with Iyari Cevallos. This podcast is where we discuss all things tech and explore the growing ways in how we can leverage technology to lead smart, sustainable, and impactful lives.
On this episode, Kendra and I discuss how we need to start being careful consumers of new technology, unpacking what Google summaries are, and how ChatGPT just isn't like the searching we're used to. Dr. Kendra Vant is a product and tech executive with experience across industry and research. Recently, Kendra led AI and data product development for Xero during its startup phase, starting with doctoral research in experimental quantum physics at MIT and a stint building quantum computers at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Kendra has made a career out of solving hard problems and pushing the boundaries of what's possible. Let's get started. Kendra, welcome. It's so exciting to have you here today.
Oh, Iyari, it's absolutely wonderful to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So let's get started on a question. I know that you have lots of experience in this space, especially in the emerging tech. And I'm wondering, should we be considering these tools that we're starting to see as the oracle of all the answers to our questions?
What a wonderful question to kick us off with. We absolutely shouldn't. And then let me clarify what I mean by that. So I think it's really important to remember that all of the really interesting tech we see coming out and we can play with it and it does amazing things, it is a tool. It's a pretty amazing tool, and I personally do use it quite a lot because I'm quite lazy and it helps me with quite a lot of things I don't want to do for myself. But I think it's a great practice to get into to just remind yourself that it's a computer, it's not a human, it's not thinking, and it makes mistakes. And one thing I love about some of the commercial services, particularly shout out to Anthropic and their Claude service, is they're all really good about telling you that. So if you're using a direct service from one of the big vendors that uses these LLMs and puts these chatbots in our hands, they're actually all really careful to say now, I'm a machine, I can make mistakes. And I think remembering that and keeping it front of mind when you're experimenting, and I really do encourage people to experiment, is definitely a great idea. So unfortunately, no oracles yet.
Look, I think that's a really good place to start in terms of, where we're at today and potentially where we might be in the future, right? So the stuff is moving really fast, but making sure that we're sort of trepidatiously engaging with these things, I think, is some great advice. So thank you, Kendra, for starting us off there. In terms of what is available at the moment, so you mentioned some products, you mentioned LLM. Can you break that down for us just a little bit for some of us that are trying to keep up?
Yeah, absolutely, because there is so much jargon out there and it can just feel like drinking from a jargon fire hose. So you'll hear the tools, and let me get to that in a sec, called a couple of things. You'll hear them called Gen AI, and that just stands for generative artificial intelligence. And that generative word is actually really useful because that's a good one to keep in your head, because what they're doing is generating. They're not thinking, they're not really going and looking up facts in a book, although some of them are using that as a way to augment the information they give you. They're generating sequences. So Gen AI, generative AI, that's one of the terms you'll hear. The other one is the one I use the acronym there, bad me, LLM, and that stands for large language model. So you'll hear people throw LLM around, and it's really just a technical acronym of how the technology was built. But again, it's another interesting one that sort of teaches us things, because what it says is large language model. We went out, we got a very large amount of information. That information was language, natural language, most of it English, although heaps and heaps more now. We're seeing a lot of other languages pulled into the training data as well. And we trained the machines to recognize the patterns that we see in language. So generative AI, large language model. Then you get to some of the tool vendors, and the big names that you'll hear in this space are OpenAI. You've probably heard of that one if you've heard of this technology at all. OpenAI's got a really close collaboration with Microsoft. So if you know the Microsoft product, you'll know that you now can see Copilot in a lot of their products. That's using OpenAI's technology. Then some of the companies that compete directly with OpenAI, Google has a model called Gemini, which does really similar things. And then a newer company called Anthropic has a model called Claude. So ChatGPT Gemini, Copilot, and Claude are the sort of consumer brand names, I might say, of the ones that you're likely to see around. They are chatbots, which is a pretty vague term, but it pretty much implies the way you tend to interact with them. So that might be that you type into a box and the machine sends text back to you. And more now, and these really are fun to play with, so people absolutely should. We're becoming to the point where you can talk to the chatbot and it will actually talk back to you. There's still a bit of lag in there, so it's not like you and I having a conversation, but it's getting pretty good and it will only get faster. And there's also some really interesting technology now where you can upload images and you can get the chatbot, the large language model, the generative AI service of your choice to send you images back. So there's a lot to explore. There's a lot of jargon, but hopefully those words will at least give you the place to hook your thinking off of and you can go and do some exploring.
Okay. And in terms of exploring, there's probably two sides to that conversation. There's exploring for work and then exploring for non-work things, right? And I think that's a really good distinction to make as we're having this conversation. There might be some differences between what you're sending or giving the model depending on the circumstance, and where you are safely playing versus where the organisation might think that you're not safely exploring from a work context. I'm just going to go back a step. You mentioned quite a few different vendors that have particular products that are on the market right now, and I'm assuming that a lot of them start with a free offering, and then they're sort of starting to commercialise, I guess, what they're offering. Why are they doing that? Like, what is the difference between Google search, say, for example, that's freely available on the internet to everyone, and some of the things that are starting to come out?
Oh, yeah, there is so much packed into that question, and it is such an important one because it's also one for us to just keep in our minds all the time when we're using these services. Let me start with a story, and I'll try to get to your point.
Okay.
I was a sci-fi fan as a little girl, so I absolutely loved it. Probably read all the crappy sci-fi you can think of, plus quite a lot of the rest of it that you can't. And if you're like me, you will have read or listened to or watched television programs with shipboard computers.
Mm-hmm.
And man, those shipboard computers were great. They could jump me across the universe. They could speak my weight. If you read Douglas Adams, they could do pretty much anything. If you're like me, you never pause to answer either one of two questions. One, if this computer is so smart, why does it need me around? Which there are some dystopic sci-fi that say we don't. But the other question that I just never asked was, how on earth did this software get created commercially? Where did this chatbot come from? And how on earth did somebody pour the amount of money it would have taken in to develop it? And the point of my story is exactly that. These things, these chatbots, they are really, really expensive to create. So that's why, inevitably and totally fair enough, folks are going to want to commercialize them. Now, there's lots of detail that we don't need to get into there about whether there's some challenges with how they're licensing and paying for the content that they're using to create these commercial services. That's a rabbit hole we could go down. But fair enough, if you're going to run a really expensive service and a useful service, it seems reasonable to want someone to pay for it. So actually the interesting question is, why don't we pay for Google? Why don't we pay for that incredibly useful service of being able to go, I need to know this, and go in and type it into a chatbot, type it into a web page? And actually the answer for that is because quite a long time ago, 10, 15 years, Google sat down and said, how much do we think people would pay for it? How much can we make if we put ads into search? And they did a back of the envelope calculation, and they figured out that as long as they were pretty good at what they were doing, they were going to make far more money from ads than they would from what they thought the market would pay for their service.
Wow.
So actually that's why search is free, because they did a calculation that said, we think we can sell ads. And they were right. And they make enormous amounts of money with it. So ChatGPT, so OpenAI and some of these other companies are choosing to monetize by asking you to pay a subscription.
Okay.
Rather than choosing to monetize by putting a lot of ad content into the service that you use.
Yes. Okay.
The pause that I would give, though, is that I don't think that you should be lulled into a false sense of security that because you're paying for the product, it will therefore be a completely blank playing field, and you'll never find commercial interests coming in through the product. So maybe we put a pin in that, but it's something that we could dig into a little further.
Okay. So that's a really good description of the difference, right? And I have forgotten how much ads play into Google search. You just don't think about these things because it's useful, and I'm just getting what I need out of it, right?
Yep.
Now, while we're on Google search, can I ask a question about Google summaries and how information potentially is being summarized? Because that seems to be something different to ChatGPT as a tool name that I'm familiar with that comes from OpenAI. What is happening in the search space? Because what you're saying around chatbots is that I ask it something, it gives me something back based on language and putting things together, but it isn't really replacing search, like it's a different thing.
Yep, this is a wonderful question. We're really getting into the weeds really quickly here. And then maybe we should circle back around and talk about freemium, which I didn't actually touch on in my previous conversation about sci-fi robots. So AI overview, which is something that's pretty much just hitting Australia now. If you're in your Google search window, you'll be starting to notice that for some queries, not for all, the first result that shows up in your Google search window is actually something that says AI overview. And what I really like about it is it's really clearly labeled that it is AI. It's not being passed off as something else. Effectively, what's happening at a really high level is Google is probably doing a relatively normal search. It's getting a collection of information about the thing that you asked, and then it is using large language models, it's using a chatbot type technology to say, this is a large amount of information that somebody might need to read through 3 or 4 pages worth of stuff. Let me summarize it and see if I can give the person the pithy answer that they want.
Okay.
That is in some ways absolutely fantastic. In some ways a bit worrying because we're losing a lot of the context that we might have about, there's the first search link, I'll click into the first search link. There's a lot of information in that search link, where the website is that served it. Is it written by, say I was Googling for medical information, is it written by a doctor? Is it a sort of a service I understand? So there's quite a lot of readjusting I think we're going to need to do to be confident and comfortable using AI overviews. What you'll also notice, they're not there for everything, which makes a lot of sense because they're going to be most likely to be useful when the density of information about the thing you're searching for is quite chunky, when there's a lot of information out there on the web about what you're searching for. If you're searching for the biography of Kendra Vant, you can imagine that the information about that's quite sparse. So I'm not going to get an AI overview for that because it really just isn't something that there's a lot of textual information about. If I'm searching for Hale Berry, I'm sure I'll get a beautiful AI overview because there's a lot of information on the internet about her.
Okay. And I'm just thinking that through for a moment there in terms of what's being returned to me. I'm assuming it's going to change our behaviour in some way. I'd be predicting as to what sort of things might happen, but, similarly with what we found with this new large language model tools, we've again assumed that what we're looking at in terms of a response is ultra accurate, reliable, doesn't need checking, because we are, I guess, highly reliant on these tools doing things in a particular way and being able to rely on them. And I guess there's also us wanting shortcuts to things. But my mind is thinking about how I normally search versus the summary. So how I normally search, I put in some words that I think will give me what I want. I then click further into the results that come through, thinking that I'll find what I need and therefore getting more and more detail and context around what is being returned to me. But in the summary, I'm not necessarily getting that. So in terms of evolution and how we should use these things, is it something that we're, I think, organically going to interact with, or should we be using them in a particular way?
Yeah, it's really, really early days with all of these things. So I think that we should really be appending, and it depends to almost every answer. But there's a couple of things in there. One of them is, and we won't go down this dark, deep rabbit hole, but there's actually quite a lot of concern, and I think reasonable concern in the academic linguistic community about the fact that we lose a lot of context when we use a summary. And so we don't know yet how that is going to impact the sort of the truthiness of the way we get information out of the internet. Because like you said, we go in, we read things, we think about it, we add some interesting context in our brains. I get used to saying, oh, yeah, that's a website I've been to before. It's given me good results in the past. I feel pretty comfortable with it. So there is a really interesting open research question there. But I think the easiest rule of thumb I'd suggest, and this is pretty much what I do myself, is with all of these things, be it large language models, be it AI overviews, because that's what that is. That's a large language model doing a summary of information. If you think to yourself, this is like a bright, really cheerful and helpful 8-year-old. And that's about the level of faith I should put in it. This bright, really helpful and cheerful 8-year-old is not attempting to deceive me. They're just being helpful and cheerful, and they're telling me what they believe is the most useful thing to tell me. I don't know about you, but when my kids were 8, I didn't actually take everything they said verbatim. If it was important to me or there was something that was really pivotal hanging on the decision, I would have looked a bit further. And I think that's a good mental model to keep in your brain.
Okay, perfect. I like that. Kendra, you also touched on sometimes it doesn't give you a summary because there isn't enough information or there isn't a great plethora of information. So I'm just wondering with the summaries or anything that's being returned that's looking at the internet as its data source. I mean, the internet isn't always, a place of truth, a place of knowledge. Not everything is of equal value on the internet from a knowledge gaining perspective. How do we need to make sure that we're thinking about that? Because I know that the internet, like even my 7-year-old relies on the internet for answers, and I'm like, yeah, that's okay for some things, not okay for others, and it depends on how far she goes down the rabbit hole of her search. Right?
Yeah.
Is it the TikTok video and she's, gathering her information there, or is she actually ending up at Wikipedia? I don't think she is. But, so on and so forth. So what should we be thinking about when we're looking at the things that are coming back to us as helpful things?
I think we should actually be thinking exactly what you said, that this is a tool that is going out, to some extent, it is going out into the internet and summarizing the information that it finds there, and it's going to be weighted by how much information was there in the first place. So, like I said, it's generative AI. It really is generating the most likely thing that would come next. So if there is lots of information about this and it's well-checked factual information, then it's probably going to do a pretty good job. If there isn't, it's still going to try to give you an answer. And the biggest challenge I think that we need to adapt to as humans is that it will sound equally as confident, equally as literate, and equally as grammatically correct, whether it's got a really deep density of information that it's forming its generation from, or whether it's got hardly anything at all. And we won't be able to tell the difference from the confidence, the literariness, or the grammar of what it brings back. And that's where we're really needing to adjust our thinking at the moment, I believe, because I think there's something deep in the back of our heads, and I'm not a psychologist, but which says if somebody sounds confident, they are well-spoken, they spell really well, and they have a great grasp of grammar, we associate that with the fact that they're really knowledgeable and that they're correct. And that's a pretty good heuristic when you're dealing with other humans. It's a terrible heuristic when you're dealing with these kind of computers. So we'll really need to keep that front of mind for a while. So I think it comes back to the test of, which we're pretty good at with Google, right? Like you commented, yeah, you wouldn't base a life and death decision on TikTok. You'd probably put a bit more weight in an opinion that you were getting out of Wikipedia. And if you're asking for medical information, you might be more confident with something that came from the Mayo Clinic than something that came from, Dr. Quack. And I think with AI overviews and AI summaries, we just need to keep front of mind that I wouldn't even say trust, but verify. I would say use it with caution and only if there isn't a lot riding on the decision.
Yes. Okay. So the importance level of what you're doing with that information comes into play, right?
For sure.
You're creating some poetry for yourself. It's probably low and quite useful in that space if you want it to sound knowledgeable.
And I think the other point I'd make on that is it's fantastically useful in an area that you already feel pretty comfortable, where you know that you could spot good or bad. Where you want to be cautious is where it's an area that you're not confident in. So let me give you an example. If I was writing an email to somebody and I was like, they're American, I'm just not quite sure if I've got like some of the American, like have I put Australian idiom in here and they're not just kind of quite make that go across. Like for instance, Americans, weirdly enough, don't really pick up the phrase horse trading. If you're talking about, you horse trade with somebody. I discovered that to my cost when I'd used the phrase several times. I would take an email, pop it into ChatGPT or Gemini and say, could you please make this email sound like it was written by an American? Or could you please summarize this email for me? What do you think it says? In that case, where really all I'm doing is sanity checking myself and getting another pair of eyes over an email that I want to make as clear as possible, fantastic, because I'm operating in a space that I'm really confident in. Having said that, if I was translating it into Japanese, I wouldn't, because I can't speak Japanese. So it's really challenging because we use it in a space that we're good at, and it's helpful. And it's easy to forget that it's helpful because we can spot the errors really easily. So I think they're great productivity uplift tools for things like, I'm just a little bit lazy, I'm just a little bit tired, I want a little bit of a helping hand. Where I'm cautious and I still rely more heavily on normal search, where I can check the sources, is where I'm really trying to find out something new, because I can't tell the difference between it confidently telling me great information that is beautifully summarized and it confidently telling me complete nonsense.
Really good points. I can start to imagine myself, where I shouldn't be asking it things. I think that example of, translated it to Japanese is a good one. If it's a topic I don't know anything about and I'm about to present on it, that's probably not the place I want someone to help me with, right, is what we're saying here. I also want to ask more about the information that it's using. I know that these models need an enormous amount of data to work well, but I think what we're touching on is, the results that are coming back, and I guess the library or the encyclopedia that is, I guess in some ways people think of the internet as, but it isn't really. When we have encyclopedias or when there is a library, it's not built by a commercial body. It is a government, building, and the library books are curated, and there's kind of all these things that go into what lives in a library. That's not really how the internet is built. And I'm wondering, how is commercial kind of content that is designed to sell you something impacting what we get back? I think let's start with that question, because I have another one. But I'm curious about that. What do you think is happening in that space? What should we be cautious of?
And that is one, again, that is going to change a lot. So probably most of our listeners are vaguely familiar with the concept of SEO, search engine optimization. Probably don't know exactly what it is, but they might have heard of it. What it is, effectively, is people working not against, but effectively trying to game the algorithms to make sure that their sites are more strongly returned, because we all know that if you're returned in the top 2 or 3 the Google results, you're golden. If you're returned below the dreaded click for more, you're almost certainly not going to get any result. So wherever humans are presented with a thing they can fiddle with, they're going to fiddle with it. That's just who we are. So I think there'll be a lot of change. And that's why I don't want people to take what we say today as set in stone, because I think there'll be a lot of change in how we see commerciality leak into the services. To go to today, so when the services came out, when the large language models came out, there was fairly clearly not a lot of curation going on in the data that was put in. So they really did go out, grab everything they possibly could. And there was reasonable evidence that they just treated it all the same. So, a peer-reviewed paper that was written by a researcher in a great Australian university was being treated exactly the same as a feed off Reddit. And there were a couple of instances in which this became quite obvious because there were some sort of hidden Easter eggs where you're like, that makes no sense at all, until you realize that there were these very unusual Reddit threads that were actually just putting a lot of weight of a particular kind of nonsense into the training databases. Now, the companies have done heaps of work on that since then. They really have. They've gone in, they have changed, and they've cleaned up and upweighted more useful information more and taken out some of the information that really wasn't adding signal. So there's already that work has gone on. What is true at the moment, which I think is important for people to understand, is there's no ethics committee sitting inside of a large language model looking at the generation and saying that's fair, correct, and appropriate. And fair enough. It's really hard for humans to do that because we wouldn't all agree what is fair, correct, and appropriate. But what we are getting is a reflection of the content that exists already. And that means that what we're getting is a reflection of a snapshot of the world as it was from, shall we say, 2015 to 2022. So that's probably where the bulk of the generated content is from. And that means it reflects the mores and the ethics and the societal expectations of that period of time. And that is not, unfortunately, a society in which every human being is treated as equal, in which every human being has the same voice, and in which every human being has equal access to all opportunities. So if we look at an example from really early language models, it was really disappointing to see that you would get results like man is to woman as king is to queen, that's fine, but then we'd get man is to doctor as woman is to, and the models would reply nurse. Now, I don't think that's appropriate. I don't imagine a lot of our listeners think that's appropriate. It wasn't the model getting it wrong. It was the model reflecting the bulk of the information that it was trained on. And we absolutely see the same sorts of things in the large language models today. We can add guardrails around that. We can add rules around that. And the owners of these models they're working hard to try to take out some of that unlevel playing field. But it's always important to keep in mind that it is trained on the internet. And like you said, there's nobody peer reviewing and curating the content on the internet because as a global population, we wouldn't agree on those rules anyway. It's not fixable, but it's something that it's really important to keep in mind.
And I mean, I'm assuming also, and this is probably the other question I was forming in my mind, and that is, there's also a limit, right? The internet isn't necessarily full of all our history. It isn't necessarily full of all of our different sorts of experiences from different cultures. It isn't necessarily full of, the evolution that we've had as a human race. So those sorts of things that we've lived through and we know and understand and have learned through our lives isn't necessarily all living on the internet, right? So there's a limit also to what these models have access to.
Absolutely. And I think that's neither good nor bad. It just is. The really important thing is that we keep it in mind. And I think it's particularly important for English as a first language speakers to keep in mind because the vast majority of the information on the internet that is being used to train the models that are most often used is overwhelmingly based in English. So those of us who have English as our first language are the least likely to notice the gaps. Whereas if you come from a language which is different from English as your first language, you are much more likely to already be aware of how gappy the internet is, of how much information about Indigenous cultures, for instance, is just missing from the internet. So I think you're just more attuned to it. You're more likely to notice it.
Yeah, brilliant. My brain is going with my little cloud on top, my little emoji. Now, Kendra, you did want to talk about something else in the sci-fi story that you had.
I wanted us to come back to freemium. That was the point that you had that I thought I glossed over, and I thought it was really important. So you made the comment, I think, earlier in the conversation about you might want to, in your brain, think quite carefully about how do I want to experiment with this for home and how do I want to experiment with it for work? And I think the further question around are there a lot of these services offered as freemium before they ask you to put down a credit card is really closely related to that. So yes, absolutely. As with all good things, we're going to offer you just a little bit to get you excited about the service.
A teaser.
Because if you had to put down the credit card before you were even allowed to use it, you probably wouldn't, right? So absolutely every single one of these companies has a freemium service. So try before you buy. What it usually is you can ask a certain number of questions a day and then you get cut off, and they'll always tell you, hey, if you want to give us your credit card now, you could get the better version. That's absolutely fine. They're not cheap. And so many people at the moment in particular will probably just play around with the freemium version. And you can do a lot, unless you are a person who really wants to sit there for, a couple of hours chatting with ChatGPT. If you've just got playing with freemium, you'll probably be fine. When you are using a free service, just like anything that's free, as my children now remind me, because I've said it to them so many times, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So when you're using a freemium service, be really aware. Anything that you tell the system might be recorded. It might be used to train the next version of services. You can make your own decision about whether that bothers you or not. But just have a think about it. If you're using a free service and it encourages you to upload pictures or documents to give you a more enriched conversation and service, which is great, just be aware. If you're not paying for it, the likelihood that the service that you're talking to is taking your documents, storing them and reusing them is pretty high. So always assume that anything you put into any of these services could end up on the front page of the newspaper. It probably won't, but it might. And then that's probably one of the reasons why you might decide you want to use a paid service. And it certainly also makes sense between the home and the work. If I'm using it to decide, I don't have any cilantro, what could I substitute in a chicken curry dish and it still makes sense? I don't really care if anybody knows I'm asking that question. I'm certainly not going to pay $20 a month to hide my lack of cooking aptitude. If I'm at work and I want to say, I have a client asking this question, can you please give me 3 different potential responses for that client's question? I really hope most people on this call listen to this podcast would think twice before they type that into a service that could end up on the front page of the newspaper. So that's one reason why you might want to pay. As soon as you put down a credit card, almost all of these companies will flip over to a situation in which they say, I'd still be cautious, by the way, I'd still read the terms and conditions, but they will give you an option to say that you don't want to contribute anything that you say, anything that you upload, any photos or documents that you share to the service. So that is a huge reason why you might consider moving from the freemium version of a product to a paid version of the product. And if you're a small business owner, it's the same. It's the reason that you might actually think, actually, as much as I can educate my team, please be careful what you share. Please don't put any confidential client information into the services. Actually, maybe that is a reason why at work I want to purchase a service. I want to take up the option of Microsoft Copilot or Google Gemini to help me with my emails and documents, because then I will have a guarantee that my confidential client information is remaining confidential. That's why I thought coming back to your very good question about freemium was something we should definitely do.
No, yeah, that's a really good point. I think there's a broad range of things that we could be using these tools for, right? So I think we've established that some of it is drafting, helping you recraft, looking at information that you're generally comfortable with and therefore are using it to potentially improve what you already do. What about things like mental health? Like, I know that there is things like AI companions and things like that that's quite different. But in terms of asking these tools for summaries on things like mental health, like it's not medical, or helping in situations that are stressful for us, do you think that these tools are useful yet?
It's a really great question. And I think, disclaimer that neither you nor I are a medical professional. And we certainly wouldn't want to suggest to anyone that you put off going and asking for human help, which is definitely going to be where you want to go if you're having challenges. Having said that, there is a podcaster I listen to who absolutely raves about using ChatGPT as a meditation coach.
Okay.
So he wanted to start a practice for meditation. He knew that, like all of us, he was a bit lazy and he was likely to get bored, go off track. And so he actually started a dedicated conversation. He pays for it so he can sort of have the long conversations, a dedicated conversation around the fact that he wanted to start a meditation practice. And he has had really great support, and he is finding it absolutely fantastic in terms of, he'll say, I'm finding it hard to concentrate, and ChatGPT, I think it's ChatGPT, comes back and gives him some suggestions for other ways other people have helped themselves stay on track. He said, I'm getting bored, and it's come back with other situations and conversations that could try. So I think I've found these tools really useful to have trial run conversations, I might say. So perhaps not mental health support, because for me, that's something I'd probably always go to a human for. Because when I'm wanting support, I really want trained support. And unfortunately, there've been some pretty terrible, and we shouldn't laugh because it has been really awful, there have been some terrible dry run mental health support bots which just have not been created with the right levels of guardrails wrapped around them. I think we're a ways off before we'd really want to go close to that. But what I've used it for and found it quite helpful is, this conversation might be a little bit sticky. I know I might say something wrong because I'm a little stressed, or you know what would be a totally risk-free way where nobody gets any blame? I'm going to trial run this conversation with a chatbot. And I'm going to get a bit of information and coaching about how perhaps what I said could be misinterpreted. So I think those sorts of ideas, when you're like, if I said this to a human, how would that human react? You probably actually can now go and say, well, if I said this to a chatbot, hey, can you pretend to be a slightly harried 19-year-old who hasn't quite finished their university exams? If I go and ask them to clean up their room, what sort of reaction am I likely to get? For those sorts of conversations, when you've got, you just want a sounding board to bat it back and forth with, I'd be jumping in and having a go with things like that. Because one thing we haven't touched on, but I think is really important, is these tools are here to stay.
Yeah.
They're absolutely here to stay. They're not going away. You might not think they're particularly interesting or really want to use them, but if you're a parent, for sure your kids are using them, and they're changing all the time. So in actual fact, finding a reason to use them, and finding a reason that doesn't just feel like a clunky replacement to search, because we're all pretty good at search, right? So we can make it do pretty much what we want. Finding a creative way to poke them is probably a really good idea. I have a friend who helps it gets ChatGPT, which is her preferred service, to help her learn Spanish.
Oh, that sounds good.
And so she's using it all the time. And so she's sort of seeing the changes. She's seeing text come along, then audio come along, video come along. Guess what? She's got 3 kids, and she's keeping up with those 3 kids and what they might be seeing as the services emerge. So whether you're a lover or a hater of the new tech, I'd be fiddling with it on a regular basis in a reasonably meaningful way, just to stay abreast of what other loved ones in your life might be stumbling across.
Yeah, no, that's really good advice. And look, Kendra, as we start to wrap up, it's been such an interesting conversation. I do want to ask, you've given quite a few suggestions on how to approach things. What are your top tips to listeners to empower themselves?
Yeah, so my top tips are jump in and give it a go. Because the tech is there, the tech is here to stay, and the tech is changing really fast. Always remember that you're not talking to a human. That might not be a bad thing, but it's a different thing, and we've all got to sort of cement the difference into our heads. Always remember that if you're not paying for the service, anything that you might be saying to the service is effectively becoming their property, and they can and will use it as they wish. And then probably my last point would be just have some fun with it. For sure, decide your boundary, decide what you're not going to step over. Be cautious. This is enabling bad actors. So turn on that side of your brain that says, oh, gosh, I bet some of the scam tools are being elevated by these technologies. Oh, gosh, this thing where I can get it to sound like me because I can get it to do a voice clone. Oh, guess the people are now able to voice clone and use it in bad actors' ways. But be curious, have fun, jump in, try it out in the safe zones that you've decided are right for you so that you don't get to the point where you're so uncomfortable with the technology that as it really actually does become a foundational part of our day-to-day, which I think it will, just like Google Maps has become that, email has become that, internet searching has become that. You're feeling confident and you're feeling like it's something that you can engage with safely.
Yeah, we keep forgetting these things are things that have been introduced. So we just keep email. It's just something we do, right? Thank you so much, Kendra, for that great and interesting chat and getting into some of the detail of what that's doing. I think it gets really great examples. You've got my mind reeling at the moment as to, how to treat these things. So I really appreciate you coming today and having a chat to us.
Oh, it was my absolute pleasure, and I hope that everyone will have fun and learn something new.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening today. Do keep in mind that this is a podcast for informational purposes, and all we're really doing is sharing our opinions on things that matter to us. With that being said, if you liked what you heard and want to continue supporting us, share this podcast with your network to help us grow and bring on even more guests. Until next time, this is Iyari from EmpowerTech, signing off.